The next card that I initially planned to revisit was the AMD Radeon R7 265. However, Fate decided that I should review the R7 260X card instead, the MSI R7-260X-2GD5-OCV1 variant to be more precise. The card is powered by the XTX version of Bonaire and it has 196 shader cores, 56 TMUs and 16 ROPs. MSI clocked this GPU at 1050 MHz and paired it with 2 GB of GDDR5 memory running at 1500 MHz via a 128-bit bus. Just like its little brother that powered the previously reviewed R7-260, the Bonaire XTX was built using the GCN 2.0 architecture, and that gives it DirectX 12 feature level support. This can make the difference between able to run a game and not, as seen on the screen right now. It is quite unfortunate that AMD provides only legacy driver support for it. At a 115 rated TDP, the card uses a cooling solution made out of 2 copper heat pipes that contact the GPU directly, and a well-sized fin stack. The MOSFETs that provide power to the GPU have their own heatsink with the associated thermal pad. Everything gets cooled by a single 4-pin PWM controlled fan. As a result, the card does not exceed 65 degrees Celsius in heaven for a delta over ambient of 40 C and 70 in Warframe for a delta of 45 C. To get a better image of what the card is capable of, we will run it in the same Z230 workstation with the same i7-4770 equivalent Xeon and 32 GB DDR3 at 1600 MHz in dual channel. Despite its age, Alien Isolation remains a pretty looking game at 1080 resolution and ultra settings. It is also fairly easy to run, and the R7-260X makes short work of it. In survivor mode, the card provided 68 FPS on average, and the 1% lows were in the low 40s, very much acceptable for the slower paced single player title. The performance in Apex Legends needs to be a bit more consistent, and while the card can provide 72 FPS on average in the firing range, the 1% lows of 46 may require dropping the resolution a bit, from 1080 to 1600 by 900. That brings the 1% lows closer to 60 FPS, and it would probably be the resolution I'd play the game. The R7-260X averaged 61 FPS in Warzone at 720 resolution and low settings. The shadow caches were left however on, since they will improve performance. The 1% lows of 43 FPS is not something to write home about, but they will allow you to roam around the map until being wiped out by the first player you run into. Your experience might be different though, depending on your skill. I benchmarked Battlefield 5 using the training mission at 720 resolution and low settings. Typically, this game runs a bit better than the previous one, and this was also the case. The R7-260X averaged 74 FPS and the 1% lows were in the high 50s. This should be quite okay if you plan to dip your toes in some online matches. The performance and control at 720 resolution and low settings is more than adequate for this single player game. The card got an average of 71 FPS when doing the usual run between ventilation and the top of the NSC power plant. The 1% lows of 47 FPS are more than adequate. Some of the cards that I played this game with managed that same number, but for the average FPS, so no complaints about the R7-260X. Rainbow Six Siege was found to be playable at all tested resolutions and render scales, from 1080 to 720 and from 100% to 50% respectively. Even the 1% lows are above 60 FPS at 1080 resolution and 100% render scale. One thing to be noted about the 720 resolution and 50% render scale, the CPU was acting as a bottleneck on occasion, and that can be seen in the 1% lows number of 100 FPS, 13 FPS less than the same figure but at 100% render scale. GTA 5 has no issues running on the R7-260X, and at 1080 resolution and normal settings, basically at their lowest, the card averaged 98 FPS. The 1% lows stayed above 60 FPS, so the game experience should be fine, performance-wise. At 1080 resolution and lower settings, CSGO ran an average of 181 FPS. I used a bot match in DDR to do the testing, as I found a community-provided benchmark to provide numbers way too different from a match. The 1% lows stayed in the mid-80s, so don't blame the card for your loss, but do feel free to credit it if you win. The other source engine-powered game from our suite of benchmarks, Dota 2, has the R7 260X netting an average of 95 FPS and 1% lows of 60. I made sure to use the same match replay at 1080 resolution and lower settings, except render scale. That was set to 100%. Fortnite has no qualms with the R7 260X, and it was happy to run at 82 FPS on average at 1080 resolution and performance rendering mode, with the view distance set to far. The 1% lows is a bit disappointing at 32 FPS, and while quite a few call the game stutternight, the game plays fine. Each time I benchmark Overwatch 2, I'm impressed with the thorough frame delivery it provides. At 1080 resolution and lower settings, the R7 260X ran at 103 FPS on average. The 1% lows of 75 is a testament of that frame delivery. Almost every card I tested in this game managed to pull the same 70% to 80% value from the average for their 1% lows, and the Bonaire XTX powered card is no exception. At 1080 resolution and lower settings, the R7 260X averaged 136 FPS in Rocket League. The 1% lows of 56 doesn't really affect the gameplay. The frame time spikes happen at camera changes and explosions that occur when scoring. Hardly a critical time in the match. Splitgate is another multiplayer competitive game, so higher FPS numbers are to be desired. At 1080 resolution and lower settings, the R7 260X managed 104 FPS on average and 79 FPS for the 1% lows. The game experience is already good, but if even higher FPS numbers are needed, then dropping the resolution to 720 will almost double these values. Continuing with online shooters, Valorant averaged 249 FPS at 1080 resolution and lower settings in the same spike planting training mission. The 1% lows scored slightly over 140 FPS, and the game plays fine. The funny thing about Genshin Impact is that I noticed that FSR 2.1 was activated as the scaling method in the settings. I didn't see this option in the past, and I have no recollection of setting it myself, so I made sure to reset everything to their lowest. At 1080 resolution, the R7 260X had no trouble reaching the 60 FPS cap on average. The 1% lows was in the low 50s, but that should not be a problem for this PvE title. As for the HiRez studio trio of games, Paladins, Royale and Rogue Company, all of them ran at 1080 resolution but at different quality settings. Paladins, 136 FPS on average and 76 for the 1% lows for mostly high settings. In Royale, the card scores 111 on average and 72 FPS for the 1% lows, also at higher settings. And Rogue Company, 131 FPS on average and 1% lows of 90 FPS at low settings. I managed to stay alive for 1 minute and 10 seconds in World of Tanks Blitz before getting blown up, and I benchmarked that part. The game has a 60 FPS cap with my monitor, so to no surprise the R7 260X averaged 60. The 1% lows was around the same cap, so no complaints about performance at 1080 resolution and lower settings. Warframe performs a bit weird. At 1080 resolution and low settings, the R7 260X averaged 111 FPS and provided 81 FPS for the 1% lows. The reason I call this weird is because the tiny R7 250 scores only 20 FPS less on average. The game runs fine despite being a poor benchmark. Recently, I have seen R7 260Xs going down in price to as low as 25 USD. so seeing weaker cards at twice that price leaves me scratching my head. For example, the GT 1030 sells for 50 to 60 USD easily, and while that card does sip on power and it is also available in low profile variants, most gamers would enjoy the performance of the R7 260X. It may be the fact that Pascal still gets driver updates, much like GCN 4.0 cards like the RX 400-500 family, and this makes me wonder, is the GCN 4.0 architecture that different from GCN 2.0 and 3.0? What is the difference between the Baffin Pro found in the RX 460 and the Bonaire XTX we just reviewed, beside the process node? I'll guess we'll see that in a future video. Anyway, no point in crying over spilled milk. Instead, I plan to play a bit more with the R7 260X, as it strikes an interesting balance between performance, power consumption and DirectX level feature support. As for this review, well, we're done. I hope you enjoyed it and I'll see you for the next one.